dapat menghadiri acara One Day with Expert secara virtual dalam keadaan sehat walafiat. Dan kami ucapkan selamat bergabung kepada semua peserta One Day with Expert yang kali ini mengangkat tema Geothermal Energy Overview in New Zealand. Perkenalkan, saya Nina Gumantina akan memandu acara One Day with Expert ini selama kurang lebih 2 jam ke depan. Sebelumnya kami informasikan, selain melalui aplikasi Zoom, kami menyiarkan One Day with Expert melalui live streaming YouTube. Apabila ada rekan mahasiswa, Bapak Ibu yang ingin bergabung, tetapi sudah tidak dapat masuk dalam link Zoom, maka dapat informasikan untuk mengikuti One Day with Expert ini melalui YouTube channel PEM Akamigas dan BPSDM ESDM. Baik Bapak dan Ibu yang terhormat, kita awali acara dengan sambutan oleh Direktur PEM Akamigas, Bapak Peri Burhan. Dengan hormat, kami persilakan.
Thank you, Ibu Nina. The Honorable Mr. Mike Allen, as the Executive Director of Geothermal New Zealand Incorporated, Mr. Drew Douglas, as Executive Director Commercial Initiative of Wintech, Ibu Ira Indirawati from Embassy of New Zealand in Indonesia, the lecturers of PEM Akamigas, and beloved students of PEM Akamigas. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, allow me to express my sincere pleasure in welcoming all of you to this One Day with Expert webinar. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of the Executive Director of Geothermal New Zealand Incorporated, Mr. Mike Allen. I really appreciate your willingness to share about geothermal energy overview in New Zealand to us. This seminar is special because it is the first time we are having a speaker from Geothermal New Zealand Incorporated in our campus seminar. Polytechnic of Energy and Mineral Akamigas is a vocational education under the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources that has vision to be the best of Polytechnic of Energy sectors in Indonesia. We have 5 study programs, including oil and gas production engineering, oil and gas refining engineering, refinery instrumentation engineering, refinery mechanical engineering, and oil and gas logistics. In production engineering study program, we have specialization area that is geothermal engineering. It goes along with our commitment to develop human resource competence not only in conventional energy, but also in geothermal energy sector. Ladies and gentlemen, now the total generation output in New Zealand, which 7,586 gigawatt hour was generated mainly by geothermal energy. It is accounted for 17% of New Zealand's total electricity supply in 2019. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, of the total installed national power capacity, 88% is sourced from fossil fuels, while 12% comes from renewable energy. Indonesia now has 1.9 gigawatt of installed geothermal power and plans to develop an additional 4.6 gigawatt to help meet the government's target of renewable energy. That being said, the target electricity generation from geothermal energy will escalate in the next years. It will be leading to an increase the investment and consequently demand of competent workers. PEM Akamigas, as a vocational education with more than 60 lectures, want to generate a qualified graduate and that compete globally. Thus, we have to enhance the skills and improve the competency of the student by expanding our knowledge from the expert from the other country, especially from the leading country in geothermal technology, New Zealand. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to Mr. Mike Allen, who gave us the opportunities from this seminar to learn perspectives and issues about geothermal energy in New Zealand. I firmly believe that what will be shared to us will give a great benefit to our students and lecturers. Ladies and gentlemen, now allow me to declare the One Day with Expert webinar event is officially begun. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Please enjoy the webinar and invest your time and effort in learning as much as possible because an investment in knowledge always pays the best interest. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Baik, terima kasih Bapak Peri Burhan. Bapak dan Ibu yang terhormat, sebelum memasuki acara berikutnya, kami informasikan kepada peserta yang ingin bertanya dapat menyampaikan pertanyaan kepada kolom Q&A. Mohon untuk menyebutkan nama dan unit bagian jurusannya. Kemudian kami akan mengundang peserta ke ruang panelis sehingga dapat bertanya secara langsung kepada narasumber. Rekan mahasiswa Bapak dan Ibu, selanjutnya kita masuk kepada acara yang kita tunggu-tunggu, paparan dan diskusi oleh Mr. Mike Allen, Executive Director of Geothermal New Zealand, dan akan dipandu oleh moderator kita yang merupakan salah satu dosen PEM Akamigas, Saudari Dr. Erdila Indriani SSI, MT. Selanjutnya, acara kami serahkan kepada Saudari Dr. Erdila. Kami persilakan.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu Nina. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the expert in the renewable or clean energy industry in One Day with Experts program. This seminar is special because we can learn directly from him who has geothermal experience. Okay, before we show presentation, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Mike Allen. Dr. Mike Allen involved in the renewable or clean energy for over 40 years as a consultant. His first overseas work was with GENGL from 1974 on the Kamojang and Darajat project. In 2013, Mike was appointed by the New Zealand Minister of Foreign Affairs to represent New Zealand interest in International Renewable Energy Forum. He has provided independent geothermal advisory support in East Africa and many countries. And Mike was appointed Executive Director of Geothermal New Zealand Incorporation, an industry association that he helped establish in 2012. From 2009 to late 2016, Mike was a non-executive member of the board of Mercury NZ Limited. Okay, before we start the presentation, okay, Mike, we will show two of our students to get small conversation with you before you start the presentation. The first student is Yoga and the other is Pradipta. Please. Hello, Yoga. Okay, Yoga and Pradipta.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Mike.
Yoga is mute.
Okay, Yoga still mute. Okay, maybe Pradipta first, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, please, Mike and Yoga.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Yoga, can you introduce yourself first?
Halo, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yoga Dwiguna, and I'm from production engineering and in sub-major of geothermal engineering in the 4th year. Thank you.
Okay. Please, Pradipta.
Good morning, everybody. Please introduce myself. My name is Pradipta Babang Murtianto, and currently I'm studying on the refinery engineering, especially on the 4th grade. And in this good occasion, would like to thanks to Mr. Mike Allen for the coming here, and we're really excited to hear everything about the new renewable energy, especially in geothermal sector. Thank you.
Okay, please, Mike.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the opportunity. And firstly, I'd like to apologise on behalf of the New Zealand ambassador who was not able to join us this morning, but he sends his best wishes. And I think, as many of you know, New Zealand has a long association with Indonesia, particularly around geothermal, but also in other aspects, and we'll talk about that shortly. But thank you very much indeed. Idia, would you like me now to go ahead with the presentation?
Okay, please.
So can I share that from here? So I should explain before I start that while I will be talking about geothermal energy, I'm also going to be talking more broadly about renewable energy in New Zealand, and also some of the opportunities that we have in terms of international engagement. My idea, I guess, is to inform you on the background of our experience in New Zealand, but as you're largely young people who are going through education, also to encourage you to think more widely about the opportunities in renewable energy. Geothermal obviously is of key interest, but also to talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening internationally. And I'm fortunate enough, as has been mentioned, to have had some involvement in some of the international collaboration on behalf of New Zealand. So as has been mentioned, I'm an independent consultant. I have a background in chemical engineering, so I understand quite a lot of what you've been studying in the petroleum industry, although I've never been directly involved in that. But obviously around geothermal in particular, with the drilling and some of the exploitation, there are many close linkages into the petroleum industry, which are important. I've spent, it says 30 years, but I've actually spent more than 30 years involved in geothermal. I started my PhD on geothermal issues some years ago, obviously. I've spent time based in the United States, running a group which was looking at the opportunities for renewable internationally. And I've had an advisory role to the New Zealand government around renewables more generally, and I've lived internationally. So I thought I'd very quickly show you a little bit about New Zealand. Some of you may know a little bit, but there's a brief introductory video which will follow, just a few minutes, just to give you a bit of idea about the country, some of the things that we do, and then I'll talk specifically about energy issues. So a little bit of background on New Zealand. It is the Lord of the Rings country, but other things have happened here as well. So one moment, please.
Te kore. Nā te kore te pō. Ki te whai au, ki te ao marama. Te hei mauri ora.
Welcome to the land of open spaces. A young country rich with natural sources of energy. Geothermal power bubbling up from beneath the earth. Wind energy harnessed from above. And hydroelectricity drawn from the nation's mighty rivers. This abundance of energy lights the country's way. And it couldn't be done without the commitment and determination of so many people. Welcome to the land of open hearts, where we genuinely care for others and strive to protect the land for generations to come. A place where honesty and integrity are valued and long-lasting partnerships celebrated. A country open to sharing its knowledge with the world. Welcome to the land of open minds, where smart, inspired people work with others to develop sustainable energy solutions and build on innovative ideas for the future. They are our best and brightest, applying their own boundless energy and resourcefulness to this incredible industry. Welcome to New Zealand. You've never experienced energy like it.
So a little bit of promotion for New Zealand. I just want to set the scene in New Zealand and tell you a little bit about the energy industry, because while you have an interest in geothermal, I think that in any country it's important that there's a mix of energy uses. And obviously that's changing for many of us as it is in Indonesia and around the world, as we'll talk about a little bit later. So one of the things for New Zealand is that we have a very high use of renewables in our generation. So we're the third highest user of renewables in the OECD, and we'll talk about how that's comprised in just a moment. But part of it, as for many people, is that we are looking towards trying to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, to minimize carbon emissions. And this year we put into legislation a zero carbon law, which essentially is designed to reduce the emissions of CO2 to close to zero by 2050. And we're quite unique in that is a law that is in place in New Zealand now. So to talk a little bit about the energy markets in New Zealand, because clearly electricity generation and other forms of energy are commercial products. They need to be produced, they need to be sold. And New Zealand has somewhat of a unique model, and it's an important part of how we've developed our renewables in the past and going forward. So if you look at New Zealand and see where we use energy, this chart shows you that on the left-hand side, the electricity is almost 80% of it is renewable. And as I said, we will talk about that. In the transport industry, we're still very dependent on fossil fuels, as the grey portion shows you. In residential heat, we have a mixture of, the country is a relatively temperate climate, so we don't need a lot of heating, but a mixture of wood and we don't use any other forms. And then industrial heat, we have a mix of some geothermal, which is used for heating processes, and we'll come back to talk about that. And then we still do use natural gas, a very limited amount of coal in industrial positions, but progressively we're trying to replace this portion of renewable, or increase this portion of renewables going forward. So talking a little bit about New Zealand and its electricity system, because that sets a picture as to how we choose sources. So we're very small in terms of population, around 5 million people. The area of New Zealand is roughly the size of California in the United States. And as many of you will know, it's 2 islands separated by the Cook Strait. And the generation for New Zealand electricity is spread throughout the country. The predominant generation by hydroelectricity is in the south, and it's transmitted by a direct current overhead system and under Cook Strait into the North Island, because this is where the majority of population is. The largest population is in Auckland, the capital in Wellington. So there's an HVDC link between the 2 islands. And the growth in New Zealand electricity is quite interesting to look at. And Obviously, over many years, industrialization's occurred in many, many countries, and there's been a steady growth of electricity since the 1930s and 1940s. And this red line here, in fact, is installed capacity in Indonesia. And the difference, obviously, between perhaps New Zealand and Indonesia is that we've had a long and slow development of a small population. Indonesia's had quite dramatic growth, changes in industrial demand, and so you've had to find ways to satisfy your energy needs very quickly. New Zealand has a mix of renewables, as I said. So the predominant form of generation in New Zealand for electricity is hydroelectric power. So this uses water. And in New Zealand, the systems are such that there's not a lot of storage for water. They're not run of river, but there's limited storage, only about 2 weeks capacity if we run out of rain or we run out of snowmelt. But we have a very long history of, in New Zealand, hydroelectricity has been important for us for over 100 years. The state's first project was built in the 1900s, and by the 1960s, there were major developments in the North Island, and then in the South Island, we began to build more hydroelectric plants. But as with many countries, hydroelectricity is environmentally becoming less and less acceptable because it does take a large amount of land. And although there are plans for some small schemes in New Zealand, it's unlikely that we will, in fact, have major hydroelectric developments in the future. The one exception is that we are at the moment considering the possibility of a pumped hydro storage project where when we have excess in renewable energy during the daytime, we could pump hydro and store water for later use during the day. Geothermal, that we can talk about in more detail, is about 1,000 megawatts. It's largely in the North Island of New Zealand. And so, excuse me, I'm just going to move this. It's in the northern part of New Zealand, and this is because of the volcanic areas. This is what is known as the Taupo volcanic rift, and Lake Taupo is in the center here. The offshore island of White Island, where there was a tragic accident last year, is based here. But this is very active from a volcanic point of view, and there's some limited geothermal in the far north of the country, but predominantly the geothermal development is here in the center of the North Island. So if you look at the history of geothermal in New Zealand, it's been slow and it's been influenced by a number of things. Post the Second World War in the 1940s, New Zealand as an island nation was looking for security of energy supply. We did not have our own oil and gas, and so everything was imported. And it happened that a number of the people who were involved in the Second World War from New Zealand saw what had been done in Italy, where the Italians had developed geothermal energy for their use. And having seen that and being aware of the geothermal resources in New Zealand, came back to New Zealand and encouraged the government to explore what could be done with geothermal in New Zealand. So in the 1960s, and the first development was in a place called Wairaki, and these are Maori names. Wairaki has now been operating for over 60 years. And this was a state-owned development. And then there were some smaller developments here in 1966, but there was then almost a hiatus in geothermal. And what happened in these years here was that New Zealand was exploring for oil and gas. And with foreign partners, we developed a very large natural gas resource off the North Island. And being a small country, that was done on a take or pay basis, so that whether we needed the gas or not, we had to pay for it. So the government was inclined to build natural gas power plants. And so a lot of natural gas was consumed in these years for power generation. But by 1990s, we began to become concerned about our level of gas resources. And quite quickly, we've started to build more geothermal plants. Some of these, as you notice, are quite small. Ohaki was a government development. Kawerau was a private sector development. There was some modification of Wairaki to improve its performance, but Rotokawa, Nafa, Mokai, and Mokai here, these are all developed by the indigenous population of New Zealand, the Maori, who own the land on which the resources sit, and they've developed those resources. And then in the last 10 years, there's been a very rapid development, and these have been projects by what are essentially the major power companies in New Zealand, and the two that are involved in geothermal are actually state-owned enterprises. So they're 49% owned by the public, 51% owned by the government of New Zealand. And these projects in particular have been joint ventures between the Maori landowners and these particular utilities. These are pictures of some of the more recent developments in New Zealand. On the left here is Te Mihi, which is owned by Contact, which is a fully private company. Na'aupurua, which is 140 megawatts, owned by Mercury, and Ngatamariki, which is a very large binary system, which is also owned by Mercury. So we've spent an enormous amount of money in the last 10 or 12 years to build new geothermal resources because we are very confident about how effective it is for our generation. In parallel, and I will come back in the Q&A more on geothermal and talk about it more, but in parallel, we've also been looking at other renewable resources. And as New Zealand sits in the roaring 40s, we have a very good wind resource in general. In the central part of the lower central part of the North Island and close to the Cook Strait, and in the south, we have very good wind resources, and those are being progressively developed. This is quite recent, and probably only in the last 10 or 15 years has wind become important to us. And at the moment, it's generating about 6 or 7% of our electricity. And there are new plants being built. There's approximately 2,500 megawatts of new plants which are being developed in future. This is a new one, Turretir, which is a nearly 300 megawatt plant in the southern part of the North Island. Solar electricity for New Zealand is not particularly common. And that's been partly historic in that the hydroelectricity and the geothermal were cost competitive. And until recently, solar electricity has not been particularly cost competitive for grid connected power. So we've tended to stay away from it, but that's changing a little bit. There are some large scale industrial installations, and this is as industries look at climate change, some of the corporate image, and also the fact that many buildings can be used for solar power without taking up valuable land. There is a growing interest from a residential point of view to use solar PV, but that is as much an opportunity for battery storage and playing in the market in terms of time of use. So if you have a battery which you can charge with solar during the day, use it at night, you can charge at night and off-peak electricity rates, cheaper electricity if you have storage. So it's a combination of solar development and also more efficient use of electricity. And we are pushing quite hard to introduce electric cars in New Zealand, and that's creating an interest amongst residential owners to have solar PV at their home, which they can use for charging vehicles. Bioenergy in New Zealand is part of our primary energy. It gives us about 10% of our energy. And as we've been building our agriculture and forestry and wood processing work, we are looking at ways in which we can improve the use of bioenergy and the use of biofuels. There's obviously competition from other sources of energy in New Zealand, but there is quite a major effort amongst the bioenergy industry to try and promote better use of waste materials for energy going forward. So if you look at the overall electricity generation in New Zealand, you can see here that's a split. The top part of this, the black part is hydroelectricity. Obviously it dominates it. There's a reasonable level of gas. There's a larger amount of geothermal and gas generation in New Zealand at the moment. And there's a very small part of coal generation, which is actually used by some of the industrial complexes. It's not fed into the grid at the moment. And then there's a portion of wind generation. So you can see there's quite a balanced mix. There is a seasonal risk with hydro. There's no seasonal risk with generation from geothermal, however. So just to give you a bit of an idea about the energy or the electricity market here, because in Indonesia with the structure with PLN, essentially you have a single off-taker. And so the generation of electricity is all retailed and marketed through PLN, and the arrangements from electricity producers are only with PLN. However, in New Zealand, we have a deregulated market, which means that anybody can generate energy from any form and can sell it into the market. And I'll explain a little bit more about how the market works in a minute. But the four major companies there, the three major companies, Mercury Energy, Genesis, and Meridian, are state-owned enterprises that I mentioned earlier. So they are 51% owned by the government and 49% are traded in the stock market. Contact Energy was 25% of the original state-owned power company, but it was fully privatized, and Trustpower is a more recent player in the market. So there's a spread amongst the four major generators, and then there are smaller generators as well. Transpower, which is in the center here and is responsible for transmission, is 100% state-owned. And then the local distribution networks and electricity retailers are generally private sector people with the clearing through the wholesale market. So the wholesale market in New Zealand is a little unique. It's imitated in the Philippines. It's a similar one in Singapore, which obviously has a smaller demand or a smaller arrangement. But essentially, it's a bid-based system. So every half hour, every 30 minutes, the system controller looks for supplies of electricity and where he can purchase them. And in New Zealand, there are about 300 points around the country where electricity can be sold from various generators. And if you could see this, you could see that there are various prices at any one point, any one time. And the price paid for electricity varies through the country. So if there's an excess of hydroelectricity in the south, the price may be very cheap. It'll be transmitted to the north. If there's a limited amount of hydroelectricity, the power in the south may be more expensive and will be transmitted back to the south. So it's a very important market. It drives opportunities for future development, and it provides a stable source of income. Just to show you quickly, well, I won't go into this, but this will be online. If you go onto this interconnection here, you can in fact see live information. I hope I don't lose you completely. Hold on for just one moment. So this system allows us to look at what's happening in the power system at this very moment in New Zealand. So you can see our live data in terms of where our generation is coming from. You can see what's been happening through the day in terms of the load and how it's varied. You can see here that we're at about 80% renewable energy. You can see what's happening on the HVDC link, which is the link between the South and the North Island, and how things are moving. And so this is quite an interesting place to go if you have an interest in energy markets. So you can see there where the generation is coming from in terms of wind, hydro in general, geothermal power here and what percentage it is, coal and gas, if there's any coal and gas in particular, and then the major hydro in the South Island and what's happening there. So you can see how that's dominating today, and that could be quite different in the future. So information on electricity and the market is readily available, and so that's very useful for all of us in terms of being able to follow it. So see if I can get back to Zoom. Get rid of this, sorry. It's like technological hitch. Go back to live, sorry. Okay. So one of the other things that I thought might be of interest for you to understand is that aside from obviously the generation and sales of electricity in New Zealand, there are a number of bodies that control the system, and these are some are state and some are private sector bodies, but they're an important part of renewable energy and how we decide what we're going to do in New Zealand around energy. So one of the things that we have is we have an Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority. So their role in life is to focus on how we can be more energy efficient and how we can increase the use of renewable energy. And obviously the public needs to be encouraged to support these efforts. And EECA has a board that's of directors, which is chosen from the population and appointed by the government. And so it has a very important role in sort of the future planning. It does not control future planning, but it advises the government and the public on how to be more efficient and how to, look forward to renewable energy use going forward. We also have regulatory bodies that control the market in terms of, obviously with a wholesale market, with a number of generators and sellers in the market, there needs to be some protection. So the Electricity Authority looks forward to see about future planning. It also is responsible for making sure that consumers have a best choice and that pricing is reasonable and that innovation is happening. So they, again, are working in the interest of the consumer to make sure that electricity price and sourcing is appropriate going forward. And we also have a Commerce Commission, which is a regulatory body that looks at fair trading and consumer credit and contract laws, not just in electricity, but across the energy sector and also in the major sectors of business in New Zealand. So they have a commerce role and they report to the government. And they do have legal powers about fair trading and other things. So just to talk quickly about things beyond electricity. So we use renewables obviously for non-electric purposes, and I've mentioned some of them. New Zealand's geothermal resources not only provide about 17% of our electricity, but they also provide about 20% of our primary energy. So the waste heat from geothermal processes is used for, from geothermal generation is used for industrial processing. It's been used for the last 50 years in the pulp and paper industry, and it has increasing use in wood processing. Timber is milled, processed, and then dried for export in the horticulture industry. And more recently, we've started to use geothermal heat and geothermal electricity combined for processing of dairy products, which are very important to us. I've mentioned already the bioenergy industry, and obviously wood materials are important sources of heat, and also they're being investigated as sources of biofuels. And while it uses electricity, obviously we're trying to encourage, as I said earlier, the use of electric vehicles so we can reduce our dependence on petroleum products, which are diminishing it, particularly in New Zealand, and reduce our importation. One of the other things that occurs as a byproduct of geothermal in New Zealand is that we're starting to produce quite valuable minerals. And there's a project here called Geo40, which is now in full commercial operation. It takes the waste fluid from Ohaki geothermal power plant, which is in the center of the North Island, and it's extracting silica very effectively. But what they're doing is they're actually looking at the extraction of lithium. So it closes the loop a little bit. So geothermal, which is renewable, has waste products which can produce lithium, which then can be used for batteries, which then can be used for electric vehicles. So it's quite a nice circle in New Zealand of what we're being able to do in the future. One of the other things that we're doing with our renewable energy is that we're looking at how we can potentially use hydrogen. Given that the cost of electricity is reasonable and is available throughout New Zealand, some people would challenge as to why we would consider hydrogen, but there are some very good reasons to look at hydrogen, because for us, using renewable energy and the opportunity to use electrolysis to produce hydrogen, we can basically have a carbon-free green hydrogen. And this is obviously of interest to our economy, And we've been focusing at looking to see if it can be used in the trucks, buses and ferries, the larger power consumers. And obviously hydrogen is used in vehicles with fuel cells, and fuel cells after the combustion of hydrogen only emit water, so there's no carbon dioxide, so they're carbon neutral, which is very important. We're starting to develop our own domestic hydrogen supplies and looking at the potential export of hydrogen. So there are some joint ventures here in New Zealand. One is with the Maori Trust, the Tuarapaki Trust in Obayashi, and they'll start production late next year using geothermal heat. Using geothermal electricity from there. The Tuarapaki has its own generation facility, and the potential that the gas can be exported to Japan in future. Irena, which is I'll show you a little bit more about in a minute, is using wind power to produce hydrogen and has started to produce refueling points through New Zealand. And if you want to get a perspective of the transport industry in New Zealand, we have a company called Fonterra, which produces anchor products, which you see in Indonesia in terms of butters and cheeses and other things. So Fonterra collects milk from dairy farms throughout the country. And these trucks, which are diesel driven, travel around 86 million kilometers a year. So the opportunity to convert them to hydrogen powered has very significant cost benefits and also the opportunity to reduce carbon emissions. I won't go into too much detail, but there are a number of hydrogen projects around the country which are being closely watched. But I thought you might be interested to see this. This is a small project which is underway, and it explains why we're looking at hydrogen.
Imagine a world where there are no toxic exhaust fumes from our trucks and cars or greenhouse gases polluting our atmosphere. A world where our factories and vehicles are running on clean, renewable energy and the only emissions are water vapour. A world where our regional communities can thrive with sustainable growth and job opportunities. Balance Agri-Nutrients and Irena Energy are working together to make that future a reality. We want to make a change that we as a country can be proud of and create a better future for our children and our communities. We have joined forces on a pioneering project that will transition Balance's industrial process plant to run on renewable energy and produce green hydrogen. This project will harness a world-class wind resource right here in South Taranaki. When the wind blows, we will use that energy to transform water into hydrogen and oxygen via a process called electrolysis. Green hydrogen, when combined with oxygen in the air, releases energy that can power trucks and other heavy vehicles, as well as cars and forklifts, even trains and ferries. The only emission produced is a little bit of water vapour. This green hydrogen will be the basis for creating a zero-emission energy and transport hub at Kapuni that will create jobs and economic growth in the region. This innovative project, developed by Irena Energy and Balance Agri-Nutrients, is reshaping not only Taranaki's but New Zealand's energy future.
So that gives you a bit of background on New Zealand, and I will come back to Yoga, who's keen on the geothermal aspects shortly, but I thought it was worth spending just a couple of minutes to talk about some of the things that are happening internationally in renewable energy. Because often we think that, you know, we're working in isolation and that Indonesia's trying to push geothermal and look at alternatives. But in fact, there's a lot of international collaboration. And renewable energy resources more broadly have been, are getting a lot more interest and attention over the last few years. It's obvious to all of us around the issues of climate change, the inevitable reduction in fossil fuels, and the desire to see that proceed. The other thing is that from a renewable energy point of view, and while New Zealand doesn't have much to do with solar electricity, solar electric generation has made major leaps and bounds in the world and has become very cost competitive. And so you're seeing major developments in solar, which are helping drive the renewable energy, industry more broadly. And there's a lot of international cooperation on renewable energy. Many countries are working together, and one of the groups that I've been involved with for New Zealand is a group called Irena, the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is based in Abu Dhabi. The fact that it's in Abu Dhabi is somewhat ironic, given that it's the center of an oil industry part of the world, but the Abu Dhabi government provides considerable financial support and logistical support to Irena, and it has a small but very effective staff there. You'll see its logo around, and I'd encourage you, if you have a general interest in renewables, to look at some of the things that they do. So they produce a variety of information. They look at the global activities of where renewables are, what's happening in the final mix, and you can see how renewables are still quite a small portion of what's happening in the total energy market internationally, but that's growing quite dramatically. And one of the interesting things is that in the last few years, if you look at the grey line, this is the installation of traditional non-renewable energy resources, particularly for electric power generation in the world. And you see in about 2012 that the renewable installations start to exceed the more traditional orthodox. So renewables is very strong internationally, particularly in the wind and solar industries. And in 2018, you can see that renewables are more than half of the installed capacity of new additions going in globally each year. And why is this happening? Well, if you look at the table here, you can see that if you look at the fossil fuel cost range here in the shaded blue area, that the renewables of biomass, geothermal, hydro, solar, wind in particular, and onshore wind more so, are all beginning to compete price-wise. So historically, renewables was rejected as expensive. This is now not the case, and so there's a benefit there for everybody to be able to use renewables. Some of the things that, as I say, one of the things that's happened is a very dramatic change in the price of solar power, and that's due to the reduction in the cost of solar panel production. And so from sort of $100 per megawatt hour down to now very, very low figures in the Middle East and other places, solar is becoming quite a major contributor to power generations. And the auctions part of this information is that this is a system of getting international partners to come into the country to bid for it rather than setting tariffs and other things. Finally, because all of you are young and are looking for future opportunities, obviously your focus is on the energy market. It's on the oil and gas industry, but I thought you might be interested to see what's happening globally in terms of opportunities in renewables. And the renewable industry is growing quite dramatically. I think the figures at the moment are there are about 11 million people employed in the renewable energy industry, and that's growing dramatically. As you can see at the top here, solar photovoltaics take up a large portion of that employment, but there's a whole range of employment opportunities through all of the renewable industries. And I'd encourage you to look more broadly at where you might have interests. Finally, what you might find is useful references and resources around the various sources of energy. These are out of New Zealand, all of them. But I think you'll find them useful sources if you want to get more background. And thank you for the opportunity to share this time with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mike, thank you for your good presentation. Now we are come to the Q&A session. Perhaps Pak Director or Pak Wakil Director have some question regarding the Mike presentation, please.
Thank you very much. We give the chance for our students.
Okay. Okay. Yoga and Dita, please have a question. Please go ahead.
Sure, ma'am. Could I have a question? Okay, thank you, Mr. Mike, for the explanation. It's pretty interesting for me that New Zealand has such a very, very great renewable energy development there. And hopefully that it could happen in Indonesia soon. But my question here is, how does New Zealand's government regulate and deal with socio-cultural issue to develop those energy conservation technology? As comparison, Indonesia is comprising with many traditional tribes that always maintaining their nature as the ancestor did. To me, it's pretty challenging in Indonesia and become an obstacle. What's your opinion to this issue, and what kind of approach that has been done by New Zealand's government that might be possible to be applied here in Indonesia so that the energy industry could increase significantly like in New Zealand? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a very important question, and it's different in each country. So New Zealand is a little bit unique in that we do have an indigenous population, the Maori population, and the Maori population have, under New Zealand legislation and historically, had a strong position in terms of land ownership and also in terms of their rights to resources. So if you went back 25 or 30 years ago, the first geothermal developments that were done in New Zealand, and this applies to other, obviously hydro and other things, but the first geothermal developments and hydro developments that were done really without much consultation with the Maori landowners, and the government had the right to access the areas, to use the land and to use it for development with very little benefit to the Maori. That is no longer acceptable, and there is legislation that prevents that. So the rules in New Zealand are such that the geothermal resource is the property of the landowner. So whoever owns the land, if there's a geothermal resource below it, then it's theirs for development. It does not belong to the Crown as such. So what has been happening, and I mentioned it in the geothermal developments, is that over the last 20 years, the Maori landowners have done some geothermal developments of their own, on their own or with partners. And more recently, there have been larger projects with the Maori, for example, in Ngāawaparua, which is a 140 megawatt geothermal plant. The tribe that owns the land on which that plant sits own almost 40% of the equity in that project. So they have 40% of the income from the project, and it's a commercial business. And that's the structure that we have in New Zealand, and that's not easy. So it's possible in New Zealand for a variety of reasons. One is that we have a deregulated electricity market, as I explained. So anybody who has land can develop a power project, whether it's a solar project or it's a wind project or it's a geothermal project. You can develop electricity and you can sell it into the market. So those people that have some particular cultural affinity with the geothermal might want to develop it, or they might want to preserve it. So our legislation around geothermal in particular restricts where geothermal can be developed. So it's a little bit like your national park situation in Indonesia. But the land that is culturally sensitive, geothermally, has been linked to the Maori people. They may have lived on that land for many years. They used it for cooking and processing, and now they may use it for tourism. Some of that land is protected and is not permitted for geothermal development. There are other pieces of land which still may be Maori owned, but there's a general understanding that if there's a good opportunity and it's environmentally sound, then there can be development. And then there's other land which may be not Maori owned that is available for development. So it's built into the legislation, and the culture is very strong. There is a willingness to make sure that there's a fair sharing of income and other things. And the Maori experience, in fact, has been taken overseas. And one of the ironic ones is that the Maori have been working in Kenya with the Maasai tribes people, because the Maasai tribes people lay claim to some of the areas in the Rift Valley where geothermal is being developed. And so we've been trying to share some of the experience from New Zealand with them to try and set up a process. So it's a complicated one, because in Indonesia, the land ownership is different. But I think you just have to move to where there is a a real understanding of the cultural value that the resource has, and a recognition that it's not good enough just to build a road and a mosque and a school and say, well, you know, culturally we've satisfied demands. You have to integrate people into it, and I think there has to be ongoing commercial benefit. So the Maori in New Zealand who benefit from the power resources spend that money on education, welfare for their people, and there's monies passed back into the community. That's not so easy perhaps to do in Indonesia, but it's something you need to think about. And I was talking with someone about this yesterday. When we went to Komojang, for example, you know, the people in Komojang were very welcoming, but it wasn't a land ownership issue, but their main concern was that Komojang Unit 1 generated 30 megawatts of electricity, and it was all used in Jakarta. You know, there was no electricity in Komojang. So there are many things, and that's changed, but it is something you need to recognize, and it needs to be sincere, and I think a long-term commercial relationship. There needs to be a commercial benefit, not just, as I say, a recognition that it's culturally important, but we disregard that.
Okay, so sir, it's possible, but still need a longer time to apply those kind of regulation here. That's your point.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. There has to be a willingness from the government and from the indigenous people and from the local people to see that it's, you know, there are some special conditions, and to have a balance. But I think there has to be a benefit for the, you know, if you want to use land that indigenous people have, then there has to be some benefit. May not be huge, but more than just a token, as I say, a school and a mosque, which, you know, it's nice, but, you know, you need some ongoing income, you need to create industry. And one of the benefits of geothermal is that there are byproducts, so the heat can be used for various things. So maybe that's the way you can help get indigenous industry going alongside it.
Thank you, sir. Understood.
Okay, thank you, Dita. And then Yoga, please have any question?
Okay. Hello, Mr. Mike. I'm very amazed of how New Zealand commit to have their electricity from renewable energy, and because I studied a lot about the geothermal itself, but I have some kind of interest about the hydropower generation itself. I mean, how could New Zealand commit themselves to generate about a big amount of energy from hydropower itself? Meanwhile, in Indonesia, we know that Indonesia also has a big lake or dam, but it is still less generation of hydropower itself. What's your suggestion for Indonesian in generating hydropower itself? Thank you.
Well, I think in New Zealand we are fortunate in that, obviously for hydropower you need either rain or you need snow that melts, and so we have a good source of water. We also have, from an engineering point of view, we have good geology that we can build large hydro dams, and that's been part of what's been positive. As I said, now we've really exploited what we can do. In Indonesia, it again comes down to the fact that hydroelectricity can be quite challenging in terms of land ownership, that, you know, you often need to flood a large portion of land for the lake to retain the water, and that's not always so easy. So, you know, there are hydroelectric projects in Indonesia. The geology is not so easy in terms of building earth dams and other things. And the rivers are relatively small, so you don't have large rivers or large flows that you can perhaps use for hydro.
4 p.m.
I think there are opportunities for smaller scale development of hydroelectricity in a rural sense in Indonesia, right down to the micro size. I'm not really qualified enough in terms of Indonesia on the larger scale hydro, but it is a challenge around land and basically sort of stability, and you have a lot of very mountainous regions which are not so easy to use for hydroelectric generation in terms of, you know, land area and construction of dams. So it's a combination of things, of not necessarily having the rivers, and you obviously have the water supply through the monsoon season, but you don't necessarily have a regular water supply either, which is a challenge for hydro. But small scale, medium scale hydro used for, you know, cooperative developments for cities rather than into the grid may well be something that can be considered. And, you know, there are a number of those scattered around the country.
Yeah, so I think if the problem is about the land ownership, I think because the lake itself is mostly owned by the government itself. So I think the main problem is about the thing you said about the geology and how to build the construction, right?
I think that is a challenge, and obviously, you know, the arable land with a large population in Indonesia is limited, and there's then competition between, you know, flooding a valley for hydroelectricity as to using it for rice production, for example. So that's always a challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mike.
Okay, thank you, Yoga and Mike. Many questions in Q&A column.
There's a couple of questions there that I can see. One's in Bahasa, so I won't try that one. There's a question about COVID-19. Generally, it has not affected the generation industry. Obviously, like everywhere, there's issues around personal safety, contact, but we've been fortunate that the renewable energy or the energy sector has not been too affected. One of the impacts for many countries, of course, is that the demand has fallen off, and we haven't seen that so much in New Zealand. The demand is beginning to grow again, but obviously the demand could slow down because industries are slowing and demand is slowing, so that there will be some impact on it. But renewables should be more favorably placed in that obviously it's a domestic product that you have and you don't have to import it. So there's some commercial benefit or economic benefit to countries. So renewables is still continuing to grow globally.
Okay, maybe next question, Mike. Can you explain about some trouble or problem in geothermal development project for Indonesia, maybe?
So some of the challenges in Indonesia?
Yep.
Well, I think that if you look at there's sort of two branches to any power project development. One is the market and the price of electricity that you can sell any electricity for. And in Indonesia, there is a quite heavily subsidized electricity market, and this has an impact on the price for geothermal. And so geothermal has to be able to compete on a price basis, and that's not always easy. That's being approached in some ways in terms of the government with PTSMI and others looking to help buy down the exploration cost of geothermal, because the early exploration is quite expensive and quite risky, and a recognition that the early stages of geothermal require very good quality analysis and interpretation. In the petrochemical industry or the petroleum industry, you have a lot of experience on doing microseismicity and seismic work to try and locate oil and gas resources, and that's well proven. In geothermal, it's not quite as simple. So the recognition that you need good quality and thorough exploration to reduce exploration risk is important, because there have been a number of projects where they've been undertaken to a drilling phase and haven't been particularly successful. The other challenge, obviously, logistically in Indonesia is that if you look, and obviously in Java, but in Sumatra, access to geothermal resources is quite challenging. So they are expensive in terms of initial roading and infrastructure before you can get going, which means that projects need to be relatively large. And so the successful projects, or the major successes, have been where joint ventures have been formed between companies that, you know, have the financial skill to take the exploration risk, to do the early development, and carry that on their balance sheet, and they pay for that before they go out to borrow from banks and other people. And so you need that combination of significant funding from corporate entities to start the process. In parallel, obviously, PGE, Geodepa, and other people are doing geothermal developments, and they have government funding and government support. So that's the other avenue. So I think the opportunities in Indonesia are obviously significant. The pricing and the cost of development is high, and the tariffs are a bit low. So it's trying to sort out that balance. And in any industry, you need certainty before you come and try to do a project. So there's been a lot of upheaval and changes in laws and regulations over the last few years, and that needs to be resolved so that geothermal has a fair footing and gets a fair opportunity. But otherwise, the potential is good. The geothermal industry and experience in Indonesia is high. We've had the privilege of training many Indonesians in the geothermal industry here in New Zealand, and we have many Indonesians who work here in New Zealand with the power companies doing geothermal. So the skills are there, but it's the financial and perhaps technical challenges that need to be recognised and addressed carefully. The social issues, they're there as well, and those we've already talked about those.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And then we know that PEM Akamigas and New Zealand have cooperation in training. Is there an opportunity to elevate this cooperation, like student internship or docent to study in geothermal plant?
There is. I mean, obviously it's restricted at the moment because New Zealand is basically closed in terms of us leaving or others coming in. So physically that's difficult, but we are doing a lot of online training. So in geothermal in particular, we have a postgraduate school, the Geothermal Institute, which has trained quite a few hundred Indonesians. As I've mentioned, it's trained about 1,500 people from around the world. That does a 3-month course. There's an opportunity to do a Masters of Energy, which can be in geothermal or it can be in renewables and other things. So that's possible, and the New Zealand government does provide scholarships, and offline we can give you some information on that. So yes, there are opportunities to study in New Zealand, and at the moment we're trying to figure out how we can run training courses virtually. We have some programs which have been in the past 1-month courses, which basically have brought people down here, 20 or 30 people at a time, and we've trained in geothermal project management and some specific topics, and also in broader renewables. So the answer is yes, the embassy can give you information on that, and we have a very strong relationship with Indonesia, and we'll continue to build on that, I'm sure, going forward.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And next question is from our lecturer, Bu Woro. The question is there any technological challenge by New Zealand in developing renewable industry? Technological challenge.
Well, I think that within the geothermal industry, that's quite well established. We are looking at different technologies. As I mentioned, the hydrogen industry is something that's quite new to us. The technology is reasonably well established, and but we have to learn how to use our renewable resources to optimize the benefit from that. I don't know that there are major technology challenges for us. Our growth in renewable demand is moderate. Our growth is only 1 or 2% in electricity demand. What we're more focused on, I think, rather than perhaps newer technology, is being more efficient with what we do. So in trying to minimize the footprint of things, so the use of waste from geothermal, the use of waste from the forestry industry, all of those things, we're trying to find better technologies to use the waste so that we're more efficient. And that's where there's a lot of emphasis around efficiency. Some of that is around technology, some of it's around software and programming and clever technologies and how best to use it. And some of it is the management of the market, so the ability to as I say, we have time of use, so you can have cheap electricity at certain times of the day. What can you do with that? So the Haringa project, which was highlighted, the hydrogen one, that's quite a clever one, where it's using wind energy when it's not required for power generation to make hydrogen. And when it can sell electricity, it stops making hydrogen. So we're learning to manage the market better and manage the technologies we've got better. That's really what our challenges are.
Okay. Maybe it's clear. And then the question is, how does the electricity price form in the market? Does government has role in determine the electricity price? About electricity price?
No, the electricity price is controlled by the market. The government does not regulate electricity pricing, and the government does not provide any subsidies for the development of renewables. So everything is done on a commercial basis, and electricity, as I explained, is traded in a wholesale market. So essentially, there is a system operator in New Zealand who controls the purchase and dispatch of electricity, and every 30 minutes, companies producing electricity offer a price. So they will offer so many dollars per megawatt hour for electricity at a certain part of the country, and the system operator then chooses it. So on average, that doesn't vary particularly much. So as a consumer, my electricity price is agreed between, well, it's offered to me by a distribution company, and it can be fixed for 1 or 2 years in terms of cost per kilowatt hour. So that's done at a market level. I can buy my electricity from one of now about 25 different companies, and those companies offer different things. So some companies will take a high risk in purchasing electricity prices, and so you may benefit or you may lose. Others will take a very conservative approach. So it's really driven by the market. The best parallel would be to say it's comparable to your telephone companies. So you can choose which telephone supplier you want to have, you know, how much data you want to buy, how much you want to pay for it. And if you don't like it, you can swap to another one. So that's very much what we can do in electricity in New Zealand. And the system, the power transmission and the distribution is set up to guarantee that we get electricity reticulated to our house. We have to pay for it, but there's no debate around the actual movement of electricity. It's just where we buy it from, and we can choose and we can change as often as we like in terms of our suppliers if they can get a better price. It's very competitive.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And then Yoga, you still have any question? Please.
Yeah, Mr. Mike. So I have one more question. Actually, it's related to geothermal energy. Actually, I ever read a journal about extraction of mineral, the lithium itself in New Zealand itself, and from what I read it is still before the things I read it is still hard to extract the mineral of lithium itself because the regulation between the geothermal and the mining itself, it's kind of different. So it is different if we have some kind of regulation about how to exploit the steam and how to exploit the lithium itself. So how do New Zealand deal with it, and is it possible also to conduct in Indonesia itself? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fair question, and to be honest with you, it could still be tested in New Zealand in terms of the ownership of the lithium and the ownership of the silicon. At the moment, the geothermal resources allow you to extract a certain volume of water every day and a certain amount of heat, and you're required to re-inject a certain amount of water. There is no control over the mineral content in the fluids at the moment, so you do have the right to extract the minerals and use them, and there is no charge for that. So our Geothermal Act used to be associated with the minerals and mining, but it's not. It's a separate legislation, and it's based basically around the fluid use and the fluid re-injection into the system. We control on how much we can take out, and we have to put a certain amount of fluid back in. So given that the solids are a very small volume, they don't have an impact. So at the moment, the waste stream can be processed to remove the silica, and having removed the silica, you can remove the lithium. I suspect that there may be some questions raised about this if it becomes a very large industry, and it could be that some of the mineral controls might be tried to be pushed back on the geothermal industry. So there's a bit of internal debate around that. But as I say, it would be, in an Indonesian situation, I'm not sure. How are the minerals treated in geothermal fluid if they are there? Are they treated as under the Mining Act?
So yeah, I think it's a bit complicated if it is a bigger industry to extract the lithium itself. So the thing I read before is the developer is also some kind of confused to determine is it a separate industry should be separated, or it's just the same with the geothermal development itself.
Yeah, I think that in both countries, probably here and in Indonesia, that needs to be clarified, and that's the hope is that it can be left as a geothermal product and not get into minerals and mining, because it's obviously quite different. I mean, minerals and mining tend to be exactly that, mining, whereas if you're extracting from the fluid, the environmental issues and the scale and things really are no different than if you're just using it for power production with a very small unit. So I would, as I say, I'm not familiar with what the rules and regulations are in Indonesia, but if there's any opportunity, then it should try to keep the minerals from geothermal fluid inside the geothermal laws and not let them drift back into mining and minerals, because they're different sorts of industries.
Okay, sir, it's clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yoga. And then next question from anonymous attendee. For of all sources of renewable energy, which one is the highest electricity generation in New Zealand? Mike, which one the highest electricity generation?
Well, in New Zealand, it's hydroelectricity. It's water. It's the hydroelectricity, so it's about 60% of our generation. So it's the dominant one in New Zealand. And we were talking about that. It's not so easy for Indonesia because hydro is not so easy to develop. So you have to push very hard to get more geothermal in Indonesia.
Okay. And the last question, maybe any suggestion or recommendation for our students to prepare work in renewable energy or clean energy or in geothermal power plant?
Well, I think that younger people have I think a better understanding and more outspoken about the issues of climate change and other things, and there are many opportunities. As I explained, institutions like Irena and others talk about the employment, and that's more the technical employment. But I think you need to be willing to think outside the box a bit. Some of the opportunities can be quite modest in the solar industry, for example, solar PV. That's one that's quite small and people can set up their own businesses. Obviously, hydroelectricity and geothermal are more difficult to do at small scale. So I think you need to think innovatively. Certainly many Indonesians are very entrepreneurial, and I think, are very good at setting up new businesses. Need to be realistic about the opportunities. But as I said, particularly in the solar industry, the price points are very low, and so there's opportunity there. So keep an open mind, understand that renewables are important, understand that renewables are part of the solution. So my generation, we were always pushing to say, get rid of fossil fuels, stop using, you have to balance. We need gas, we need a balance. So I think you need to be willing to accept you need a balance, but can you play a part in the wind industry or solar or others, geothermal? Take the opportunity to get into renewables. It's certainly what's going to be important in future. So that's where the opportunities are.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Very inspiring. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, we are come to the last agenda. We would like to say thanks again for speaker, Dr. Mike Allen, and all of the participants. The conclusion of presentation today is New Zealand has diverse renewable energy from geothermal, biofuel, solar, wind, microhydro, and hydrogen cell. So we have a benefit from my presentation and hopefully open our mind regarding this renewable energy to be applied more rapidly in Indonesia. Hopefully, the presentation give benefit for us. Thank you for your attention. See you later. Okay, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bu Nina, time is yours. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bu Ira.
Terima kasih Bu Erdila. Thank you Mr. McAllen. Baik, rekan mahasiswa Bapak Ibu, untuk selanjutnya akan kami persilahkan kepada Direktur PEM Akamigas, Bapak Peri Burhan, untuk menutup acara ini secara resmi. Kami persilahkan kepada Pak Peri Burhan. Pak Peri masih gabung dengan kami?
Okay. Sorry.
Kami
Thank you,
persilakan,
Bu Nina.
Pak.
It's okay. Baik, thank you, Bu Nina. Yeah, okay. On behalf of the Polytechnic of Energy and Mineral Akamigas, I would like to express my appreciation to our speaker, Mr. Mike Allen, for taking time out of your busy duty to attend the seminar and to share very interesting yet available knowledge about renewable energy in New Zealand. It has been a pleasure to be able to learn the perspective for green energy development in New Zealand, with so many renewable sources for electricity generation. I really hope that we will have another great opportunity to discuss, perhaps about a mutual cooperation between New Zealand with PEM Akamigas in order to improve our student competencies to cope today's challenge in renewable energy development. I would also like to thank all the panelists, moderators, and participants for your active participation. Thank you very much and good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Dan selanjutnya kita akan lakukan sesi foto bersama terlebih dahulu. Kami persilahkan kepada rekan host untuk memandu.
Baik, terima kasih Bu Nina. Thank you very much, Mrs. Nina. So for all the panelists, would you like to turn on your video so I can take the screenshot for this meeting, for this webinar? And please give your best smile to the camera. Okay, thank you. 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mike and all the panelists. I give it back to Miss Nina.
Oke, makasih Mbak Dini. Baik Bapak Ibu yang terhormat, dengan demikian acara One Day with Expert pada siang hari ini selesai sudah. Kami ucapkan terima kasih kepada Pak Peri Burhan. Thank you, Mr. McAllen. Terima kasih kepada seluruh partisipan. Kurang lebihnya kami mohon maaf. Selamat siang dan akhir kata kami ucapkan wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Mike Allen.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bu Ira.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you all. Thank you, Pak Mike. Thank you, Pak Ferry.
Be very happy to talk more about geothermal another time if you would like.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Of course.
Oke, terima kasih
Oke.
banyak.
Terima
See you.
kasih.
Terima kasih,
Terima kasih.
Mr. Mike. Terima kasih, Prof.
Terima kasih, Bu Dini.
Terima kasih Yoga dan Rita.
Ya,
Pak Yende,
makasih juga, Bu.
terima kasih Pak Eko.
Oke,
Pak
makasih
Anu.
ya.
Kami terima kasih Bapak Ibu.